Good afternoon, everybody, to our afternoon session on non-military strategies for countering transnational crime and cartels. My name is Patrick Quirk. I am Senior Advisor in the Atlantic Council's Freedom and Prosperity Center. For this session, I'll offer a few framing remarks, introduce our esteemed panelists, and then we'll get right into the discussion. Hopefully have time to come to all of you in the audience, as well as online for your questions. To kick us off then, cartels, as we all know, are a scourge on the prosperity of people across the hemisphere and frankly a dire national security threat to the American people. Mexican criminal organizations in particular are responsible for the majority of drugs funneling into the United States and therefore the thousands of overdose deaths across this country. Amongst other challenges, cartel violence drives migration across our borders. Yet, even though we're focused so much on Mexico, as we should be, the threat extends far beyond Mexico. From South to Central America, groups that were traditionally considered gangs are now operating like transnational criminal organizations that control territory and manage illicit economies. Recognizing the severity of this threat, President Trump recently designated several cartels as terrorist organizations and recently launched his Shield of the Americas initiative to quote-unquote eradicate cartels. Solving this problem, if we can solve it, clearly requires military tactics to, for example, locate cartel leadership, eliminate rank and file. Yet while kinetic tools like drone strikes, military raids are necessary to address this challenge, they are by no means sufficient to realize a sustainable solution. Non-military tools are not just complementary, but frankly what ultimately determines whether security gains are indeed sustainable. As one example, bullets might kill a single drug kingpin, but they're not going to eradicate the political corruption and weak institutions which enable cartel bosses across the hemisphere to operate with impunity. This panel, therefore, is going to talk about the role of non-military tools in solving this problem. To do so, thankfully, we have two really excellent panelists with decades of experience working on these issues, as well as national security writ large. To my far left, we have Connor Pfeiffer, who is Senior Director for Government Relations at FDD Action. Previously, Connor served as Policy Advisor to Senator David McCormick, where he, amongst many other hats, spearheaded legislative initiatives on these very issues. And to the center here, we have Noy Villalobos, who's Chief Programs Officer at Creative Associates International, which is a global company providing comprehensive programming solutions to support U.S. national security interests across the world. For format, I'm going to ask 3 rounds of questions and then time permitting come out to the audience for your queries. Okay, let's get started. For this first round, I want to talk about understanding the multifaceted nature of this problem. Connor, as someone who's worked extensively on this issue, can you paint a picture for us of the threat that cartels pose to American interests? In particular, what factors contribute to the problem, and therefore why military tools alone aren't sufficient to address it?
Well, thank you, Patrick. No, it's great to be up here with y'all, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for having this discussion. Let's start with the homeland, right? You alluded to it, Patrick, in your opening. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have died from fentanyl overdoses, from fentanyl that has come from Mexico and other parts of the region. The DEA assesses that cartels and other criminal groups have a presence in all 50 states of the union, right? So these are criminal networks that are not only moving drugs, but doing arms trafficking, creating other types of criminality that really affect American communities. And then, of course, you have the nexus between cartels, especially in Mexico, and illegal immigration, right? Because you have these cartels profiting handsomely from the flows of migrants from Central America and other parts of the world that have come to the Western Hemisphere through Mexico and across the US-Mexico border as well. Then when you zoom out to the region more broadly, look, these groups destabilize countries all across the region, right here in America's backyard. And that's a huge problem for the United States, right? These groups also create weakened states. They weaken state institutions, which creates more opportunities for US adversaries like China, Russia, and Iran to expand their presence and networks in the Western Hemisphere too. And then finally, the violence not only terrorizes the people in these countries, but it also creates security challenges for American businesses, for American expatriates, for other American interests that are directly on the ground in these countries. And so I think that's kind of one way to look at the different threats posed by these groups to the United States, both on the homeland and within the region. Now, in terms of what factors are driving this, right? Obviously, you have rising demand globally for narcotics. Part of that's the United States, but you've also seen a massive expansion of those markets for the cartels in South America, especially in Europe, Asia, and Africa. And so not all the drugs are going to the United States, they're going to these other markets too. And so that significant increase in demand means that there's a lot more opportunities to make money, to keep these business infrastructures in place to expand the cartel's presence and ability to do this stuff. And then you're also seeing a failure of governments to exert territorial control over their own territory, right? You have a situation in Mexico and Colombia, for instance, where the government doesn't have full control over as much as 30 or 40% of their actual national territory. These are areas where maybe there's some government presence, maybe there's no government presence. The cartels could be the ones calling the shots, different transnational criminal groups. And so even though you might have state structures in place, you might have mayors and other officials, really they're not the ones in control of the territory. Candidates, for instance, in the Colombian election aren't able to campaign in those areas. So that creates a lot of problems as well. And then finally, what I mentioned is you have this transition, especially in South America, from guerrilla groups that were primarily ideological motivated, right? The FARC, Shining Path, other groups that had their origins in the Cold War, where maybe they were doing drug trafficking to make some money to support those efforts, but that wasn't their primary goal. Now you're seeing many of these groups focused on this nexus between narcotics trafficking, they're designated terrorist groups by the United States, even some before the Trump administration. So this narco-terrorist nexus has really taken over from groups that in the past you saw primarily guerrilla activity, where it was ideologically motivated. So that's also been an important factor.
So Noe, coming to you, Creative has had operations globally, to include in many of the countries that deal with this problem. How have these organizations evolved, and what factors have enabled them to expand?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Connor. Thank you, Patrick. It's lovely to be here with you guys today. Yeah, definitely we've worked in all of these places, especially in the Western Hemisphere. And I would say that what we've seen across the region is this evolution into these transnational criminal ecosystems. And where gangs and groups before in Central America, for example, were just gangs that were either regional and just maintained relationships just with their United States counterparts, are now becoming part or a node in a very large system that I would say is actually a full cartel supply chain. And it involves everything from corrupting systems and institutions, as you mentioned, to building these relationships and alliances throughout the region that enable them to tap into these global markets. And so these nodes, they control territory locally, which is one of the key aspects that local territorial control is key for them. And they diversify their market by working themselves into licit and illicit markets and conflating both of them. So what we're seeing right now is that some of these groups, and they've been designated as TCOs, are working in real estate, mines, all these licit economies and markets, but they're conflating them by money laundering and processing that would be illegal. And by doing that, it's much harder for prosecutors and governments and even the United States to be able to identify which is licit and illicit work. And isolate them to be able to disrupt them. So when we think about it as a system, I would say that what we've seen is a couple of factors that make the system work well. One is that they're entrepreneurial and sophisticated in how they operate. Again, they're embedding themselves in governments, they're embedding themselves in markets, and they're doing so with increasing sophistication. They've even sent their kids or proxies into universities, and they're becoming prosecutors, they're becoming judges, they're becoming the people on the administrative side to manage a lot of the permits that are necessary for businesses to operate. And so they're using these mechanisms to blend themselves into complex financial systems and to corrupt those systems. I would say they're also adaptive. They're incredibly adaptive. They're so fast. They're faster than the bureaucracies of the governments that are trying to attack them by leagues. And in that in their ability to be adaptive, they're also capable of reconfiguring themselves, subcontracting that work, and they also can regenerate quite quickly. So when you see one head being taken off, quickly somebody else is in charge, or they've found another person. They've set themselves up to have succession plans. And then another thing I would say is that what's enabling them is the weak institutions, the weak systems in our countries. There's lack of governance, and so you have weak judicial systems, police and law enforcement that is penetrated and distrusted by the communities that they serve, municipal governments that cannot provide services. And when those factors, and you can think of all of the governance factors, come together, these groups can become really durable and they can take hold because that's what they need in order to access the resources to be able to scale. And finally, I would say that they have an incredible ability to attract new recruits. They are able to sustain themselves because not only do they terrorize these same communities, they force them to also rely on them for their security on the ground, and they also force them to participate in the process. And so little by little, you see communities being co-opted into this, and that's where their recruitment stems from. I think I'll stop there.
That's great. I mean, both of you clearly are well-established, bona fide experts on the really complex nature of the problem, but you're also experts, specialists on how to solve it. So for the second round, let's talk about solutions. Connor, you've written extensively, even prolifically, especially over the last couple of months, about military and non-military approaches required to suppress cartel activity. If we center for this conversation on the non-military approaches, if you were talking to the White House, which areas should the U.S. be focused on? And in particular, how should we use our finite foreign assistance resources to greatest effect?
Yeah, I'll try to do my best to answer all that. Two general principles first. One is you need to do both. You need the security focus options. You need the non-security focus options because, as Noe alluded to, if you only focus in one area, you're going to have gaps in the other ones where the networks are going to stay in place, and these groups will be able to continue to metastasize over time. The second is you need willing partners, right? There's only so much you can do in a country if the government's not fully invested in the same thing. I mean, and obviously this is a security side example, but the reason you had some successes, for instance, from Plan Colombia, is because the Colombian government under three presidents was very invested in following through on taking the U.S. help and doing things with that, right? But I think two areas I'll focus on. First is illicit finance, right? At the end of the day, these drug cartels, transnational criminal organizations, however you refer to them, they're multinational companies, businesses essentially. They're trying to make money, and in order to get the money back from wherever they're selling drugs, in many cases the United States or Europe or other places, and get it back to wherever they're based, whether it's Mexico, Colombia, or another country, you need another criminal to launder the money for you, right? You have to have those financial flows. And so going after their ability to move money effectively really raises the cost of doing business. And it prevents them from being able to fully realize the profits of their illicit activity, which over time weakens them. And in the case of cartels that have developed military capabilities, they're launching FPV drones like you're seeing in Ukraine, you're seeing that in Mexico and Colombia and other places, right? Well, the only reason they can afford that kind of technology is because they're making many, many billions from drug proceeds that are able to repatriate from the United States or other places back. So how do you go after this? One example I think that the Trump administration has done last summer that I think they should do more of elsewhere is you saw an order from Treasury using authorities from the Fentanyl Sanctions Act and the Fentanyl Act, but you could extend these authorities to other types of narcotics as well, where they issued an order saying 3 Mexican financial institutions would be designated as institutions that are a primary money laundering concern, and therefore by a certain deadline would be cut off from the U.S. financial system. Was a massive signal in Mexico that there are problems in your financial system and we're going to take unilateral action in the case of the United States to address this. Before the deadline for the action to even go into effect, all 3 financial institutions were either sold, broken up for parts, or just out of business. So the order didn't even have to go into effect because that's how important access to the US dollar is for major financial institutions in many of these countries. Now, of course, you have to be careful using tools like this because you don't want to destabilize a country's entire financial system. But at the same time, if you have clear evidence that financial institutions are allowing brokers, including many brokers from China, to move proceeds from fentanyl, cocaine, or other narcotics through their financial system, and they're not doing anything, even if the U.S. asks them to, and not enough is being done by the local financial intelligence unit for that country, then the U.S. at a certain point is going to need to start taking action there, because it's the U.S. dollar and access to the dollar that's being used to move those proceeds back to fund criminal activity in the countries that these groups operate in. So that's one thing I'd flag. Another issue that's becoming emerging is obviously the illicit mineral extraction, especially gold. You're seeing a lot of this in Colombia and Nicaragua, obviously in Venezuela now as well, where armed groups are using the extraction of otherwise legitimate minerals, merging them into the legal markets, and then using that to profit heavily from those kinds of activities. So they're expanding beyond narcotics into extortion, mineral extraction, these other areas, which in some cases can be a lot more profitable. And if you're able to extract minerals illicitly and then get them into the legal markets, then it's almost more profitable than sometimes the narcotics trafficking is. And the last thing I'd flag is combating impunity. And within that broad category, I put efforts to strengthen judicial systems, police forces, prosecutorial systems, because you have many countries in the Western Hemisphere where impunity is over 90%. That means of all the crimes committed in a country, 90% of them don't result in prosecution or a final judgment of some kind. In many cases, 80% of that is crimes just aren't reported because people know that they bring crimes to local police forces and prosecutorial offices, nothing's going to actually happen. And then of the subset of 10 or 15% that are actually investigated, investigation resources aren't there, so they can't prosecute them. And even though the ones they do prosecute, not all of them are able to get through the judicial system. And so the U.S. has a long history through INL and other offices of providing assistance with improving judicial systems, improving police forces. Now, the long-term results of that, because of problems with commitments from local actors, isn't always consistent, right? We poured billions of dollars into Mexico's judicial system, for instance, and now they have a system where they're electing judges, many of whom have ties to the cartels, right? So we've had some setbacks in that area, but that work still remains important, because until you get rid of impunity in these countries, you're not going to be able to stop the long-term presence of these criminal groups.
Well said. So Noi, shifting from approaches writ large to foreign assistance programming, Connor talked about illicit finance, other areas. What programmatic interventions have you seen work, where, and why?
Yeah, thanks. I think that the ones that have worked are ones that address the system on the ground. And so I'll focus on a couple of examples where, one, you're following the money, and two, you're also improving the institutions, because the governance piece has to happen. And I can't emphasize this enough. It has to be coordinated, and it has to be sequenced and complementary to military or other enforcement actions. So, for example, we worked with vetted units in Honduras, specifically to target extortion at the local level. And we did this not only by working with the communities, the National Police, the Anti-Extortion Police, but really focusing in on what does the system need. And we decided that what it needed was actors from the private sector. And so we built alliances between the Anti-Extortion Police, communities that were being affected by extortion, and the private sector that was the one that was financing the extortion. And what we found was that we could secure transportation routes that before were being extorted throughout. We could secure the path for vendors to be able to enter into some of the hottest and most violent communities in Honduras. And we were able to work with vendors to be able to report incidents. We worked with the transportation companies, the buses, to be able to report extortion on the routes that they were taking. So these specific pieces of the system for following the money, understanding that you can work alongside INL's vetted units, for example, investigative units, we had prosecutors, we had financial intelligence groups, and doing specific case management, but that looked at the entire system for how that extortion process worked, allowed us to make some gains. And we were able to reduce extortion in the areas where we were working. This was part, of course, of a larger sort of process. And in that case, it was a place-based strategy that INL was implementing in Honduras. And so what we did is we targeted certain sectors. We targeted certain communities that the government wanted to address, and we worked with the Honduran government, the national police, their intelligence offices, and also their social services ministries to build their capacity to come in together in a very specific and sequenced form. So if it was too hot, then the military would come in and cleanse that area. We did this also in Colombia, in the southern regions in Colombia, where they would come in, they would clean, the police would come in, and this is vetted units of the police, trained units of the police. And then we would come in as part of the government and support the government, and this is US financed activities, assistance. We would support the government to be able to provide services. And why? Because if you just take out those elements in the community and you take out the gang group or the cartel or whoever's acting in that community in that moment, but you don't address the systemic and structural issues of governance, providing services, leading to trust and credibility of the institutions that are there working, then you can't really sustain those systems over time, because the minute the police has to move to another community, they'll just take over again. So essentially, it's about not having fragmented responses. It's about being coordinated. And the other element and piece that I can't stress enough as being super important is, remember how I mentioned that these groups are so adaptive? It's understanding how they operate, assessing what they're doing, how they're moving money, understanding how they're affecting communities and people and institutions, and having those atmospherics, that information flow, and knowing that that information flow is not only going to help you program at the local level, at the community, and at the national level to build those institutions' capacity to address the issue, but also that that information is going to flow up, and that it will be used to address that larger system that is the transnational element of it by either the US government or other actors who are working towards the kinds of things that you mentioned.
So both of you walked us through most recently some solutions, and then prior to that, the multifaceted nature of the problem. For this last round of questions, before I get into it, I would ask everyone in the audience to start thinking through questions you might have for our panelists. Let's talk about what success might look like, and how do we know it when we see it? So starting with you, Connor, from a national security standpoint, what does success realistically look like in countering these networks, and how should we measure that progress over time?
Well, where I started obviously was the homeland and then the region. So I'll start with the homeland. Obviously, the top priority is to protect the safety and security of Americans and the people who live in the United States. And so what are we doing in terms of making communities safer? Are we are we able to do things outside the United States that make the organizations operate in all 50 states, from the Sinaloa cartel, the Jalisco cartel, Tren de Aragua, whatever group it is, make those networks weaker in the United States? Are we able to reduce crime tied to drug cartels in the United States? And of course, are we able to reduce the amount of drugs flowing into the United States? Both seizures, but also there's things that get past our borders as well, whether by sea or by over land, and so reducing what we're not seizing as well, reducing those flows. And then on the financial side too, what does it look like to reduce those financial flows, right? And now some of that you can measure, some of that's more qualitative, right? But those are some of the KPIs you might look at for the homeland. For the region more broadly, over the long term, look, these are not going to be things you solve overnight, but over the long term, are you making forward progress in key countries to improve the ability of those countries to have control over their territory, to do some of this same work that we're talking about with financial flows and better policing in their own countries, right? So they're not dependent necessarily on the United States always coming in and helping them with some of this stuff. They can build the ability to do it themselves, right? And so those are a couple things that I think that people should be watching. Some of that you're going to see improvements from a change in government, a new initiative, those sorts of things. Those things might take place quicker, but in other areas it's going to be the project of years and maybe even decades at times. But you want to be making forward progress. But as I mentioned earlier, you need partner governments that are willing to work with you. For going back to Mexico, for instance, we've seen a significant change from under President Lopez Obrador and going to President Sheinbaum, where under President Lopez Obrador, there was a policy of hugs, not bullets. And so the security situation significantly deteriorated in Mexico. And while President Sheinbaum's from the same party, and was her mentor, she's taken a different approach to security. Now, is it perfect? No, there's a lot more we need to be doing there, but there has been an improvement from where things stood, and that just took a change in government, right? So you can't, from the United States' perspective, we can't always control what's going to happen in other countries, right? Many of these are democracies, they have their elections, they're going to have governments get elected on platforms and priorities, but we do have levers and tools we can use to push things, hopefully help push things in the right direction in these countries, especially when it directly affects national security interests that affect the lives and security of Americans.
Yeah, the Mexico case clearly shows how political will is so essential to actually moving the needle on some of those KPIs you just outlined. Noy, building on this, from your experience working on the ground, executing these projects across the globe, what indicators or changes signal that those types of programs are working in practice?
So agree that it has to look like criminal control is receding and not by the numbers of heads of people that you've taken out, right? So on the ground, in the communities where we work, we would be able to see that businesses can do more with less coercion, that there's less extortion, that the transport corridors are secure, that local officials, and you alluded to this before, are making decisions without being coerced or criminal interference involved in those decisions, and that people can rely on the public institutions. And in these local economies where they've been taken over, those small changes are significant. At the institutional level, I would say that we would look for things where you demonstrate that the state is more capable and more trusted. And so a lot of surveys about how people feel in terms of their safety and security and whether they would go to their state institutions for that support. And that it will look like, for example, cases that are being prosecuted and moved from investigation to prosecution, stronger financial investigations in that country, and corruption facing real consequences. And then more broadly across the region, you feel the pressure going down, and it shows throughout the institutions and at the local level. And you see that because there's less migration flows. You see that communities are less taxed by that criminal presence, and there's less dependence on the illicit income that produces. And all of this, all of this ties to our U.S. national security interests here. Because when we have these more stable communities, more stable partners, then we can transact with them better in a more equitable way, and we secure our supply chains that we rely on. So I'll stop there.
So noting that we have about a minute and a half left, rather than going to the audience, I want to use moderator's prerogative to be a bit provocative and ask a final question. What would each of you say if someone came in and asked, well, what about the model in El Salvador? Why shouldn't we just do that, lock everybody up, maximum incarceration? Is that right? Is that wrong?
It's effective to a degree in the short term, right? And I think we've seen those gains, right? People feel safer. There is less extortion. Some of those indicators I mentioned at the local level. But I would say that there's second order effects to take into account, and that there is a structural and systemic issue that has not been addressed yet. And in doing the way that El Salvador has been doing it and operating in this fashion, you're reducing the legitimacy and accountability for operating within the rule of law of these institutions, and you need that in order for the people to be seeing these institutions as their legitimate partners.
Look, I mean, obviously President Bukele has seen significant success in reducing crime, gang presence in communities, extortion, all the things, some of the things that Noy alluded to. But I think what's important to keep in mind is every country in Latin America is very different, right? El Salvador is relatively small, so it was an option to potentially go after, do a dragnet approach with rounding up people who could be suspected gang members and prosecuting them and going through a process. But in other countries that are larger, like take a Mexico, a Colombia, a Brazil, where we're seeing growing criminal activity there as well, you need more of a security forward approach than probably past governments have taken. But at the same time, you need to be doing all the things that we've talked about here as well. And so I think it's important to keep the context in mind of what country we're talking about. You can't just copy paste the same playbook for different countries. Obviously, President Noboa, for instance, in Ecuador, has taken some of the stuff that Bukele's done in El Salvador, but also adapted it in other ways because it's a different context you have in Ecuador, for instance.
Country specific, super important. I think the through lines for these conversations: one, there's no silver bullet. Two, we can't just use bullets. And then three, there are indeed non-military approaches, but they have to be coupled with the kinetic strategies currently being implemented. Thanks so much again, Noy, Connor, for joining us.
Thank you.
Next up, we have James Mazzarella coming to the stage to conclude the forum writ large. Thanks everybody for being here.